Hello and welcome to the last Blue Sky Ballot brief behind the ballot during this election season. Thank you for joining us just 4 days away from Election Day. I'm Greg Loerts, I'm the senior consultant here at Blue Sky, and today I have the honor and pleasure to be joined by Sahir Khan, co-founder and executive vice president at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. So before IFSD, Sahir worked in the financial sector and then spent over a decade in the public service, working at Treasury Board, the Privy Council Office, and then at the PDO as the Assistant Parliamentary Budget Officer, or as I've heard the joke, Assistant to the Parliamentary Budget Officer.
That's Sarah. Evan here treats me as Dwight Schrute all the time.
Yes. So I'm glad to have the Dwight Schrute here to go and talk numbers. Sahir, pleasure to have you here.
Oh, my pleasure's all mine, Greg.
So, today we are talking platforms. So all the major parties have officially released their platforms over the long weekend for the NDP and the Liberals on Saturday, and the Conservatives dropped their platform on Tuesday. So, here you've read and analyzed all of them. What was your first impressions for the respective Liberal, Conservative, and NDP platforms? What stuck out, and what does it show the parties think the ballot question is?
Well, Greg, it's interesting. They're all late, right? We're days to election day. Much of the advanced polling, was well underway, in some cases done, and then we see these platforms, and so you wonder if a bunch of issues that were for some of the parties traditionally sword issues became shield issues by virtue of waiting this late. But when we do go through the numbers and from our assessment perspective, what we're really trying to do is figure out, do the colors match the cuffs? Is the narrative that the parties put out, or is it matched by the measures behind it? And if that is coherent, then you could actually get a pass. It's not about who's just got the lowest deficit. It's about, who's telling a story that's backed up by actual measures that kind of make sense, that are roughly, costed well, and we're still fiscally sustainable at the end of it, right? So it's less ideological than some might believe when you say it's a fiscal credibility test. But when you look at these from the money angle, it looks like they're actually answering three different ballot questions. If your anxieties around Canada's independence and sovereignty, economic security, and resilience, and a nod to affordability, the Liberal platform is speaking to that. And also probably a fairly pronounced policy shift from the Liberal years, in that we're seeing a shift from social spending to economic, more capital-oriented spending. I think as the Liberal leader has kind of talked about on the campaign trail. So a different trajectory on spending, to be sure, or a maintenance of that, but a different composition of spend, but a very specific ballot question. When we look at
so it's not Trudeau's platform. It's not the communications you're seeing online.
Right. And so I think when people just look at the bottom line numbers, okay, it's more Justin Trudeau, but in fact, it really isn't. It is a response to a different ballot question than we had a few months ago, and a different composition of spend, that really reflects probably the priorities of the Liberal leader, Mark Carney. If this election were held, 3 months ago, and it was Justin Trudeau against Pierre Poilievre, it might have been about who's the best accountant, who's the best money manager, right? And it's just not that. Now, when we look at the Conservative platform, by the numbers, you look at the tax reductions, you look at the efficiencies, the cancellation of the climate program, you're basically seeing an appeal to a smaller state. So it's a change, but it's a change to something that, is not necessarily responding to the same ballot question as the Liberals, but maybe appealing more to their base on the smaller government question. The NDP is really interesting, and I don't want to just focus on the first two, because I think the NDP, we like to pay attention to, because, Jagmeet Singh got a lot of stuff through in a minority position, and might end up going down on kind of Ed Broadbent level of having influence, of put a lot of NDP ideas into a Liberal agenda. And so when we look at the NDP platform, we see almost like a logical continuation of the social policy kind of wealth transfer agenda of the Liberal government, but maybe on steroids, right? And it's very much an NDP opposition style platform, not one like the Liberals and Conservatives, very much governing platforms, and the NDP, it's an opposition platform. Not the type of platform a provincial NDP government would kind of put together, but one that says, hey, I know where I'm going to be in Parliament. I'm going to put some ideas in the window I'm not in a competition to have the lowest deficit when this is done. So, Greg, kind of in a bit of a nutshell, that's how we saw the numbers tell a story about the ballot question and kind of the agenda intentions of these three parties.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think you definitely touched a bit already on the Liberal Trudeau conversation, but what's the biggest departure that you see from the Trudeau era Liberals in the current Mark Carney platform? Isn't that switch between investing more and spending less, or what are we seeing here?
Well, if you look at kind of the spending measures, the increase about 129 billion, really evenly split between capital and then operating, which is everything else, the program spending and the operations of government. So that's a pretty big departure. When we think about the growth in spending under the Liberal year under Justin Trudeau, we had a history of from Chrétien to Martin to Harper, the prime ministers, three of them. Spending was about 12 to 13% of GDP. So program spending, government spending was around 12 to 30% of the size of the economy. Under the Prime Minister Trudeau, this hit about 16%. The state got bigger. And a lot of that was social spending. 40% alone of that increase was in Indigenous spending. So it wasn't just that they said they believed in reconciliation, they allocated a very large sum of money against it. The Achilles heel of the government would have been on delivery and execution. So the real questions will remain, what did we get for that spending? But, if people believed there was a social contract for 30 years, it was clearly a departure from. For this new Liberal platform and the Carney team, the Mark Carney team, they can't really touch the level of spending. I don't think you're going to move the needle on that 16% very much between any of these parties, because what are you going to roll back? Dental care, pharmacare, child care, the child benefit. It's difficult to kind of advance those kind of social policy cutting ideas in an election. And I think as policy wonks, you kind of hope for that. You hope that, okay, we'll be honest, we're going to do the following things. But I think the realists enough say this is a platform, not a budget. They're going to put their best foot forward. As Chris Rock says, when people are dating, the first date, it's really, you're just meeting the ambassador of the other person, not the actual person. It takes a few dates to get the real person. And I think that's what these platforms are. And that's why we say we test them as a platform, as a presentation of ideas with numbers behind them, and not a budget where you got to think about the how, and does it really add up, and are you really going to get that money out in the first year, and are you lapsed, are you going to get those savings? Those are questions for another day. They're certainly important, but that's kind of the distinction we make between the two. And so this split on capital and basically a difficulty in kind of moving that total government spending line is a function of whether you want to address the independence issue with the U.S. So if we want to have a response on defense, it's impossible to kind of lower the spending trajectory and still get to the NATO 2% target. And that target might later go to 3%, so we might not be done with this. It's really difficult if you say, I want to have more resilient infrastructure and more independence in our supply chains from the United States and from China. Well, that's not free either. And a tax cut won't do it. So I think that's where that agenda is actually determining this platform and why on the aggregate numbers, it can't be that much of a departure from what preceded it, but for a different reason and a different composition of spend.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you touched on it a little bit there too. It was interesting for me to go and see that the Conservatives were committing to keeping dental care, child care. They were keeping a lot of the social, baked in operating expenses of the federal government while they're spending, rather than doing an industrial strategy as the Carney Liberals have put forward. They decided to put forward a tax cut heavy platform in a way that maintains, to what you said, that increased base operational spending around those core programs that, quite honestly, the NDP forced the Liberals into putting in during the last parliament.
And that's a good point, Craig, because I think this is a little bit of the hard coding of the fiscal structure that the Trudeau government kind of left behind. And for Mr. Poilievre, Mr. Carney, there's really not a lot of politically, it's not easy to depart from that. And I think that's the reality of these elections. I think for Canadians, they might intuitively think, well, I long for the days of Jean Chrétien, but that was $90 billion in nominal dollar terms ago, right? And if you say, okay, well, yeah, I want to get there, but what am I going to cut? Oh, surely it's in the civil service. Well, the total compensation bill is $65 billion, and you cut all that, planes are falling out of the sky. Like it's really difficult. It's why you see all these parties go after efficiencies, consultants, other types of procurement efficiencies that they think they're going to get because they don't want to say the word. We might have to cut program spending, and that's what they're all avoiding during an election.
Yeah, I think that's a really good segue. We got a question in advance of today's webinar here, so I actually want to get into that because it is entirely on cost savings and those two items. So Lauren asks, I listened to Mr. Claude on a Hill Times podcast talk about how vague and unrealistic it is when parties promise to cut waste to reduce government spending. Wondering what you think now of the platforms on that. The Conservative platform has a few ways they're reducing spending, bracket, many that seem over-optimistic, close bracket. The Liberal platform has just one attributed to government productivity. Feels like a lot of money to cram into one line item. So what do you think? I mean, on that point, what's not said here? And what do you read between the lines of these platforms that are saying, here's our giant reductions out of a very small amount of line items?
Yeah, I think Warren kind of hit the nail on the head. Like, to make these numbers work, you've got to find some kind of a fudge factor, right? And I say there's alchemy in all three of these platforms. There's no question. I think why the Liberals scored a little bit better than the Conservatives, because it had more alchemy. They had the same efficiency. In fact, Liberals had about 28 billion, and the Conservatives, I'm looking at the latest tally we have here, and 34 billion for the Conservatives. So they went even harder on these efficiencies. And I can tell you just from 20 years of experience, they're not going to materialize. Right? These are things that we put in the window, and previous governments have all said we're going to save this money, or we're going to leverage attrition. Do you know how many times we've counted attrition in government budgeting? So they're going to have to do something else. I think what distinguished the Liberals and the Conservatives added another 60 billion in revenue on top of their forecast on what we call dynamic scoring, or a light version of it, which is we're going to be so good at deregulation and the measures and the tax cuts, we're going to get 60 billion more in revenue from the increased economic activity. The IMF just said Canada is going to likely grow by 1.4% next year. This implies that we're going to grow by 3%. Well, those are magic measures if we really think. So that's where everyone had alchemy. The Conservatives just had more of it. So if we, to your part B of the question, Greg, so what does that tell you? Well, if we go back to what ballot question we think they're answering, and maybe your second question around, so what's the real strategy here? If you don't get these efficiency savings and you're the Conservatives, you're basically going to probably look for more cuts, administrative cuts. You're going to say, well, I couldn't find the efficiency, I'm going to have to cut somewhere. And the 2012 draft exercise led by Tony Clement was really interesting in that they basically got their savings by laying off public servants. And I'm not putting a value judgment on whether that's good or bad, because I think we've argued at the IVST that the public service actually run too large. And there are very humane ways of kind of reducing it. And so somebody's going to have to take a look at that and reduce the absolute numbers. No one wants to say what they're going to do. But I think they're going to be down to having to do that before they start to get into program cuts. We saw some of these on the environmental agenda side that the Conservatives are advancing right off the bat. Again, fits with their agenda, right? But at some point, they may have to look at social programs as well, and that with a combination of layoffs. On the Liberal side, if I'm going to read between the lines, and we wrote this in our assessment, this starts to feel like a pretty significant program review. Because if we read the rest of the document in terms of what Mark Carney and the Liberals are trying to do, they are trying to do this very pronounced shift from social spending over to an economic security defense agenda. And that means that that review exercise will probably end up looking at the composition of spending. As programs sunset, as their authorities expire, is there an opportunity to replace something that's on the social side that may not be working, may not be effective or efficient, and replace it with something on the economic side that might boost productivity, might drive the economic engine of the country, which eventually should give you, more revenue and all that good stuff down the road. So I would look for after the election, both parties, what happens after, oh no, the books are a lot worse than I thought. Wow. Quelle surprise. That happens after every election, right? Every change in government. So they're going to do that. And then they're going to say, wow, this is really hard. And then I think you're going to see the real agendas. And it's not terrible for either one. It's not a value judgment, but I think the Conservatives will probably look a lot harder on the administrative costs of government. And they're going to look at programs that don't fit the agenda. I feel liberals will do the same thing, but rather than cut it, I think they're more likely to reallocate. And I think that's what distinguishes probably that if we want to know what might happen by reading the rest of kind of the narrative they put out, I think that's a safe way to look at it.
Yeah. Do you think that in a minority situation, this kind of throws a lot of that for a loop? Because right now, if the liberals do drop when the block resurgence comes in, we may see liberals with a blocked support for minority. But realistically, the liberals are in relatively comfortable majority territory. If that does drop a little bit, we may see a scenario where it's 5, 6 seats that's separating them from a majority, and the NDP are projected at 9. Does the NDP or bloc really, especially the NDP's pro-union stance, would that impact any of these cuts and efficiencies in the public service if it's a liberal minority?
Yeah, it's a good question, Greg, and it's interesting because this is actually why when we train public servants and others on how the government's kind of the black box of budgeting and the cabinet process, and we always urge public servants to read all the platforms. Not just the one you think you're voting for, but read all of them. And often the NDP one gets dismissed. But we say, like, where do you think the other people get their ideas from? Like, they're borrowing from each other. A good idea is a good idea. And you could see during the campaign that the Liberals were just borrowing some of the good ideas that the Conservatives had. And we know over the last 10 years, the Liberals borrowed a whole bunch of ideas from the NDP. And so the agenda shifts. You're right, Greg. The agenda starts to shift. You stop being able to do all the things, maybe the braver things that you want to do that require a majority government. So cutting costs is one of them. Really hard to do unless you have a majority government. A significant reallocation of spending, kind of bending the cost curve, but in terms of the composition of spending, hard to do if you don't have a majority government. And so all of a sudden, the NDP play kingmaker in that they're starting to say, well, yeah, we got a lot of union support, particularly the public sector unions. We're not sure this is the right way to do it. So we want you to look elsewhere. And that those are constraints. So that just makes it harder for partisan government. Going back to Warren's question, those efficiencies get to be a lot harder to get. The yield's a lot lower. And so then you're trying to figure out, okay, well, now am I living with bigger deficits, more debt service costs, which is what we saw during the Trudeau years as we kind of went from that 12 to 13% up to 16% spending relative to GDP. There's a pressure. And I think that's something that we got to keep an eye on. And it's the reason why we do pay attention to the NDP platform. We read them and score them because we've watched them have an influence in politics, depending on the composition of parliament.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. No, for sure. And that's kind of, I think it is interesting, regardless of who the minority government is. In minority scenarios, you have to pay attention to all of those smaller parties. And there is the possibility, theoretically, that the Conservatives and Liberals could agree on something to support each other. But we've seen time and time again, when you have that title of Leader of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition, you do anything and everything to oppose. You might get hammered on it afterwards for saying you voted against X, Y, and Z, but you say this is a government, we don't agree with the government, on principle we have to oppose it. So those minority parties really have a lot of outsized influence in minority parliaments. And
I would also think that, if the Conservatives have a large minority, let's go back to the Chrétien years. When they were going through program review, Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien, the opposition at the time was the Reform Party and Christian Manning. So you can imagine, had it been a different composition, even in a majority government setting, you might have had a different type of pushback on the difficult things Prime Minister Chrétien and the Finance Minister Paul Martin had to do. So who the opposition is actually matters. And I think the Conservatives, even if they're in opposition and have a large number of seats, there's an opportunity for a great deal of influence, particularly through committees and that kind of work. So I think the agenda, the governing agenda, is still subject to change. And I think that's what we're going to see after the election as we get into transition, and how aggressive governments are going to be, the new government's going to be, of whatever stripe, and trying to get its agenda in, because after 18 months, you own everything your predecessor left behind. All of the landmines have been planted for you. You own them after 18 months, right? And they're going to trip you up. And then, the opposition, after they've had their internal civil wars, they're going to find their feet, right? And then they're going to start getting the committees going again. So you've got this little window to kind of put your stamp on a new government. If you lollygag and you don't take it as seriously, and you're still too busy high-fiving yourself, you're going to miss the opportunity. And I think that's why these platforms matter. we see them translate very often from the election right to the speech from the throne and into 1, 2, or 3 budgets. When I worked at the Privy Council office for Kevin, with Kevin, we were serving under Prime Minister Harper, and every time they said, "Oh, the Conservatives have a hidden agenda," and we would be saying, "What hidden agenda?" They wrote it all in Stand Up for Canada. We're literally taking the headings for the speech from the throne that we're now transposing into the budget. They are doing exactly what they said they would do. And so you get a really good example of why, whether you agree or disagree with the party in power, reading the platforms matters because it should be what they're going to then try and implement. Um, and and that's how that's how you also get democratic legitimacy. If you show up and you do the opposite, then what's the point of elections?
Yeah. No, definitely. I'll see here, look, it's been wonderful. I know we could definitely talk about this for another half hour quite easily, but I do know we have to wrap it up here as we are well over time. Can you just tell folks where to go and find all of IFSD's analysis of the different party platforms?
Well, if you go to ifsd.ca, we have a publication section and we have a blog called The Last Stage, a play on Kevin Page's name. And all of the platform assessments are there. You can also go to Policy Magazine, policymagazine.ca, and they have compiled all the reviews for us. And for tomorrow, we're going to do an op-ed that kind of summarizes, particularly the conservative and liberal comparisons. Gave you a bit of a preview today, and you'll see that up in policymagazine.ca tomorrow.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Sahir, for being here and for tapping your platforms. And thank you to all the attendees that came down for the final during the election edition of Blue Skies Behind the Ballot. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.